welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us again today. And we are continuing our journey through the Daodejing, and we are currently in chapter 58. And so I'll go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. All right. So today I'm using McDonald's translation of the Daodejing. Not that there was a lot of problems with the other ones, but this one I think just kind of evened out a lot of the things that were maybe needlessly confusing. It's a little bit more of a loose translation, but I think it still gets the point across really well. I will bring back in Addiss and Lombardo at the end because there's always something you wish a translator would do a little bit differently that you see with other people. So we'll just kind of work that out as we go. Let's go ahead and jump in. Interesting. We were having the discussion about the debate, and we're having a discussion about the government here in this chapter. If a government is unobtrusive, the people become whole. If a government is repressive, the people become treacherous. So this has been a little bit of a theme in the second half of the book, where the first half is focusing more on Tao, and the second half focuses more on De. There's a lot about how this plays out in terms of that more political aspect of human life. And again, the context for where this is emerging is in the Warring States period of ancient China. And there's a lot of concern about how did we get into the kind of social chaos that that they were experiencing during that time. And so a lot of the focus or the question was about how do we get out of this crisis of everybody fighting against each other essentially. But one of the things we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about the situation that they were in terms of how they thought about government is essentially smaller communities that were primarily agriculturally based that were essentially self-sufficient. So there's a lot of this kind of hands-off approach in terms of how they thought about government that was maybe a little bit more practical in the sense of the context that they find themselves. I think there's still things that are applicable that we need to think at, when we're thinking about our current situation that can still be applicable, but they're probably going to be a little bit more nuanced, where we have to think about the differences between smaller agrarian communities that are primarily self-sufficient when we think about our modern world, which is much more interdependent. We've got, a lot of places where they don't actually produce any of the things that they actually need. They depend on it from imports or coming from other places. So there's a little bit more of a tangled web that we have in our current modern day context. However, there's a lot of pressing issues that we're facing that maybe are related to that. And so maybe one of the things that we're coming up against as we're thinking about our current political situation is scalability to the degree that we've done things actually possible? And I don't mean in the sense of just like technically trying to figure out how to do it, but even from a sustainability perspective. And maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. But at the core here, the Taoists tend to come across sounding a bit like libertarians, basically have the government stand off as much as possible. And again, within their context, we can see where that would be, something that could make more sense. But even now, even if we take it into smaller organizations that we might be a part of, some type of civic group, or maybe a religious organization, or other types of groups that we might belong to, when we see leadership becoming more intrusive, it becomes more, in a sense, oppressive. It feels that way to us. Um, and and so I think there's a lot of different ways that we can look at this, even if we're thinking about work or different businesses that we're involved with. You guys have any initial thoughts about how they're looking at the two different ways of the government functioning that's creating a consequence in terms of how the people experience it?
It's just interesting. I think I brought this up before. It's interesting that so long ago they were thinking about this and recognizing these issues, and yet here we are,
Hmm.
like still experiencing the same kinds of things.
Yeah, it's not an issue of human condition that seems to go away.
Yeah.
Well, let's see where this is going to take it then. So it starts off with this idea that, if the government is a little bit more hands off, that the people are going to be whole. Or I think that what they're trying to express here is have more of a sense of well-being, or as we saw in the last chapter, there's a lot where they will take up the task of getting themselves organized and taking care of things without needing all of that bureaucratic or hierarchical oversight. So it's going to start to say a couple of points here to illustrate why they think from the Taoist perspective that that's the case. And it starts with saying good fortune has its roots in disaster. So we start to see a little bit of this yin yang approach again, where there's these opposites that have a relationship to each other that are not necessarily in conflict, but maybe they have a transformation that happens where one thing gradually transitions into the other and back again. Or the other thing that I think we have to consider when we're thinking about some of this is their reluctance to apply the value judgments to things, like being able to say that something is good or bad. We go back to the story about the farmer that loses his horse and how the situation keeps changing in terms of its evaluation from the townspeople of whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. And it was the same event, but as time progresses and they see more context or how things unfold, their evaluations keep changing. So there's some kind of interesting relationship between what feels like this is a good thing versus this is a bad thing. And they're saying, if you're thinking about that good aspect, it's actually has its roots or its foundation in this what we might consider more bad situation. And consequently, why can't I talk this morning?
Sequentially.
Consequentially, there we go. Disaster lurks within good fortune. So we kind of see, both sides of this thing. Who knows why these things happen? Right. So there's like this ongoing cycle of things shifting and changing, going one way or the other. And maybe we could get into more of a technical explanation of why these things happen, but in general, we can say there's a relationship, and why there's that relationship and why do they do that in an ultimate sense, maybe we don't know, and maybe we're never going to know, and we have to be okay with that. Or when will this cycle end, right? So clearly it keeps going. And this is maybe a crucial point, is it doesn't ever actually come to an end. It's an ongoing transformation. Things are constantly in flux. The idea of impermanence, that things don't stay the same, is crucial to understand. That if we're going to think about how things need to be governed, if we don't understand the central point that things go through transformations and that we can get caught up in doing these value judgments that we might, end up wanting to hold on to one thing, it's going to create a disruption because it needs to continue. It needs to go through those cycles. And we are not always comfortable with change, and a lot of our systems really don't account for change very well. And so we end up in a very unnatural way trying to cling to one aspect of this cycle and resist the idea of that change when it's going to be inevitable. It's just part of how life or the universe works. They're going to kind of state this then a little bit differently. Good things seem to change into bad. Bad things often turn out for good. These things have always been hard to comprehend. So, um, yeah, it's just, again, there's this constant transformation, and we have to figure out how do we get good with this? And specifically, that's at a personal level, but if we're thinking about from a governing perspective, and again, we can take this at all different levels, whether we're thinking about the household or we're thinking about a community that we're involved in or a business we're involved in, all the way up into, how do we govern something like a state or a nation? Thus, the master makes things change without interfering. So this was a key concept that we saw last week about non-interference. This is this is one of the areas where I was a little frustrated with the translation here, and we'll look at a different one in just a moment. But we get we can see a theme that's happening here that's pretty consistent. Is that the sage or the master, or we might say like the sage king or the sage emperor, finds a way to orchestrate things without interfering. And I think that the core here is that the role is to create the context in which things can evolve in more of their natural sense. That it creates a context where people and things, beyond just humans, can flourish in the way that they need to. Um, there's a lot that is put forward about Taoism as being like the first environmental religion in a sense, or environmental philosophy, because it really decentered humans in the picture. They weren't the focus. They were an aspect of the whole. And the concern was, how does the whole work, not just how do humans do the best that they can. And so when we're thinking about this government aspect, how governing happens, it's more about protecting and ensuring that the natural order of things is allowed to unfold. And then this translation is working to be a little bit more gender inclusive. So even though the original text would always have sage understood in more of a masculine sense, they're including the female here. And it says, she is probing, yet causes no harm. So if we think about that introductory statement, this idea of, becoming, involved in things here, there's an involvement, there's an understanding that happens, but it's not disruptive. Excuse me. In some sense, there's a way in which we can try to understand a situation and what's happening and working towards um, whatever goal or resolution that's trying to be achieved in a way that is non-interfering, but also not causing harm, but it's still active. It's not a philosophy of inaction. There's definitely an active part of it, but it's with a great deal of consideration about how things interact with each other. And then straightforward, yet does not impose her will. So this would be getting back to that again, the problem of certainty that is impossible to actually have. We can think that we know what the right thing to do is, but then again, we're getting into those value judgments about what should happen. And they're suggesting that maybe we don't actually know. We might have some ideas, we might have some thoughts about which direction we should go. And maybe through that probing, we're going to get more data that's going to help us continuously refine that. But frequently we find people saying, I know the way, and this is the right thing. That is the wrong thing. And I'm going to make you conform to this, even if you maybe disagree. And we see how badly that frequently works out because no one can ever know everything about anything. So we're always provisional in our understanding, and that level of confidence that allows us to feel like we can impose our will on others is something that continuously needs to be kept in check because it's an easy trap to fall into. Humans are it's very natural for us to feel like we understand what is actually at stake and how things should unfold. So here they're saying that there's a way to go forward, but it's done in such a way where it's not just simply imposing the will. And then finally it says radiant and easy on the eyes. Here they the translator takes this as kind of a continuation. All right, that there's a radiance and it's easy on the eyes. What we'll see in the original text and how it's frequently translated is there's more of a concept of it's bright, but it doesn't stand out, or it's not um, hurting the eyes, as opposed to in this case it's just kind of expanding on it. And I think the concept here that we've also seen frequently throughout the Daodejing is this idea of not standing out. It's not about achieving personal glory or trying to gain that um, renowned or fame or status change, right? It's about, yes, you're doing things, and maybe the way you're being in the world stands out because of that harmony and that balance, but it's not about becoming special in that sense. It's recognizing that everybody still has their place. As we've seen when they've talked about rulership in the past, it recognizes in the same way that they said good has its basis in evil, so to speak, in the previous part. They would say that nobility or those hierarchical positions have their basis in the humble. It's through the people and the support of the people that somebody in a position of rulership actually has their position. So radiant, yes, when somebody is in harmony with things and doing things in a way that works right, it's maybe bright, maybe it shines as a positive thing, but it's not for the purpose of standing out. And so this last part that is like this conclusion that's happening at the end of this chapter, I'm going to go back to our Addiss and Lombardo for just this part because I think there's a lot that's added here. Hey, welcome, Dane. I haven't seen you for a little while. So this will then restate the one we just saw, but it's coming from the Addiss and Lombardo translation. Therefore, the sage squares without cutting. So one of the things that I think is key here is we've seen that cutting is a term that's associated and sometimes used synonymously with the idea of governing. And when we think about the Taoist concept of uncut wood, um, to take it in reverse order, maybe the idea of carved wood is how do we get things to conform or change their shape, so to speak, so that they fit better within some type of larger organization. And so again, if we're thinking about governing, we're thinking about how potentially citizens then are being kind of carved up to fit within a particular pattern that's beneficial for the government, but maybe not necessarily beneficial for the individuals. And so there's this desire from the Taoist perspective to say we need to allow people to be who they are, this idea of uncarved wood. And how we deal with that is not by trying to get them to conform to something that they don't fit in, but by having a system that allows for those differences. So there's more of a movement towards harmony how these different things can work together as opposed to conformity. How do we get everybody to be the same thing? And then corners without dividing. So we have a similar concept here, that there's a way that things can come together in terms of, when we think about squaring something, we're making it true, we're making it come together in the right way. Or if we think about how we corner something, we're dealing with a similar concern. How do things fit together properly? And the goal here is, how do we do this in such a way that we're not cutting and dividing? So the implication is there's more of this desire for a harmonious way of bringing the differences together, where maybe the different voices in a musical situation, where you bring those together in a way that you're not trying to make all the voices make the same note, but they have different notes that fit together and create something that's more beautiful than if you had just a single note. That harmonious way of looking at things brings or celebrates the differences rather than trying to squelch those differences and bring about the conformity. And then again, strengthens, or excuse me, straightens without extending. The previous translation, I think, helped to explain this one a little bit better, where it was saying is able to straighten without imposing the will. And here, extending is maybe a way of bringing about that similar concept. And then the final part is shines without dazzling. Again, I think this had to do with the ability that when somebody is practicing this harmony and creating a context in which things can flourish, there is this, appeal, there is this shine, but it's not done for the sake of fame or standing out or being more virtuous. And so here it's bringing in the without part instead of the and in terms of dazzling. So I've got a few more things I want to talk about in terms of where I think this chapter is going, but maybe we'll pause for a moment and see if you have some thoughts about how this chapter has unfolded.
I think it's kind of gone into a little bit of this before, like be more of a coach and not so much of a manager or a dictator.
I like the coaching idea.
Yeah, I was kind of getting the same thoughts. It was bringing me back to an old boss I had that was very much followed this kind of path and helped me kind of develop into the role that I am now. And it was never, hey, you need to do this. Hey, you need to do this. It was very much a guide and kind of help nudging me in the right directions of things, but never actually saying, hey, you need to do this. You need to do that. It was, hey, what do you think about this? And let me get your thoughts on this. And it was more of a helping hand that helped focus my goals. And even in projects and things like that, it was very letting me control my own destiny type thing. But being that guide, and all the squares without cutting really kind of came to fruition for me, because that was a good example of, like, he very often would give me examples of why he thinks something wouldn't work or whatever, but he would never enforce that and let me understand on my own to get to that point of where he's at, of his understanding. And that would kind of help me. It was kind of molding me into the understandings that he already experienced. So it was never, hey, you need to do this because I know it's not going to work. It was, I don't think you should do this, but go ahead and see what you can do. And if it worked, cool. I proved him wrong. If not, it was kind of that squaring off of, okay, now I get it.
Yeah, learning from failing. Yeah. So it's interesting, and the work stuff has come up a couple of times here. When we do well at work, or when we feel like we're more fully engaged, what are, like, there seems to be like two basic models that people employ in order to motivate employees to do things. And of course, you've got one, which is, the threat of, trying to, do your job or you're going to get fired or go faster, or maybe dangling the carrot that says, hey, if you work hard, you're going to get this bonus or whatever. But then there's a whole nother approach that is much more about, maybe along the lines you guys were mentioning, with this kind of coaching approach, or ways that it was helping you to actually grow as individuals. And it sounds like there's a much stronger response to the second way of approaching things than to the first. Why do you think that that isn't utilized as much? It seems that the majority of our experiences have been people who either threaten us or use the carrot, as opposed to that more personal cultivation approach.
I think
I think
the carrot is easier and it's wider expanding because the coaching aspect is more personal. You have to get down to that person's understandings, what their goals are. There's a lot more involvement from the leader's perspective of I have to care. And the carrot dangling can be something that you dangle for many people without having to fully divide your attention across all of them. I think it's because if you have a smaller group, then it's easier for the leader to focus on those individuals personally. But if you have a company of 500 employees, how do you build that out the same way versus, hey, I'll just give you all a big bonus and then you'll be happy. I think it really comes down to ease. And when leadership finds, hey, if I can offer everybody $10,000, then it's a lot easier than saying, hey, I can make you really enjoy your job.
Taylor, it seemed like you're about to say something.
Yeah, it's kind of along the same lines. Like, it's definitely easier, and I think a lot of people grew up with that kind of parenting, so they just default to it. Like, it's a lot easier to just be mean to somebody or threaten somebody than it is to have the emotional intelligence to connect with them and realize that, like, the positive reinforcement is always going to win. And we've been told over and over again that positive reinforcement is way more effective than negative reinforcement. But I think because the negative reinforcement is what a lot of people are used to, especially, I feel like the older you are, the more used to that you are. It might get phased out eventually, as we start to have more emotional intelligence across the board as we go through time. But yeah, I think it's just people don't know or understand that the positive reinforcement is actually, and the patience, really, you have to have a lot of patience, which I think a lot of people are lacking, is really going to go a much further way and get you better results.
Yeah, I think with our fast-paced business world, it's difficult to feel like we can have the patience because everything has to happen right away. Yeah, and I think the other thing that you're kind of picking up on is it requires a certain amount of skill to be a coach, to be able to have that emotional intelligence, as you said, Taylor, and how do you connect with somebody. And because that's harder to come by in terms of those people skills, maybe that's part of the reason that you're saying is or I think Chaz was saying it's easier to default to the, the punishment or the carrot, because it doesn't require as much skill to be able to pull that off. Dane, I don't know if you had any thoughts on this before I go to the next part.
Nothing specific, thank you.
Okay. So yeah, it's an interesting dynamic that we find ourselves in. We can see how.
I think
Sorry, go ahead.
it's a reflection of the education system. The the corporate structure and the job market largely is a reflection of the education system, which is
Mm.
sort of motivated the same way, the carrot and stick. Actually, I think it goes the other way. The education system is based more on a factory model,
Mm.
which then kind of shapes the rest of the workforce. But um, it the the idea of the factory is that everything is the same because we have parts being different sizes and things don't work. So there's what makes factories work is the drive towards uniformity and conformity, and the education system is sort of a model is a result of applying that model to schooling.
Hmm. Yeah, I think education's another area we could definitely look at applying these things, or observe how they're applied or not applied. And I like your concept of the factory, because if I've got some automated system in place, I don't want some unique thing. I want a gear that's specifically this way in order to move this part the way it needs to move. And so then the individual pieces are you're much more concerned about shaping them to be the right piece. That's almost becomes like this interchangeable thing as opposed to a unique thing. And this really, I think, shows up a lot in how we experience our collective experience, if in different groups or businesses or in state type things, that the system is really designed more like a factory, where we need these specific parts for this factory to work, instead of a system that actually celebrates or can utilize the individuality. Yeah.
And the two models I think of are the factory and the garden. The factory is where you want everything to be uniform so it's interchangeable. The garden is where you kind of nurture each thing to individually express itself, which ironically is the origin of the term kindergarten. It's supposed to be a garden of children,
Mm.
but the rest of
Yeah.
the rest of after kindergarten, starting with first grade, the rest of school doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
Dang, I knew I liked kindergarten for a reason.
Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting, I think that was brought up earlier, is the effectiveness, right? So there seems to be a more long-lasting and maybe ultimately more productive outcomes when there's more of that cultivation of the individual, as opposed to trying to get them to conform to something. So there's this ironic kind of shift where it seems like the easy way to do it is to just threaten and to use the carrot, because we need the results right now. But ultimately, you're not getting the same level of quality of output that you would if it was more focused on making space for people and finding out how we can cultivate them and let their particular skills shine. So, yeah.
If you're familiar with permaculture principles too, uh, I think the parallel between like conventional farming and permaculture farming is also similar, because conventional farming is more like a factory model where you're trying to get uniformity of genetics and spacing and everything, as opposed to permaculture where it's more like you're creating an ecosystem that you're helping to thrive, and a uh, it's rather than like leaching nutrients out of the soil and requiring input of external petrochemical fertilizers and things, like essentially turning oil into food.
Mhm.
You're over time you're building up the health of the ecosystem, um, that it's like an intentionally designed ecosystem that grows plants that humans can eat, but um, it's uh, it's designed in such a way that everything supports everything else, and over time it grows and becomes more and more productive, just like a naturally occurring ecosystem would, but it's not uniform. Things aren't planted in rows. Like different crops grow together and support each other and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that
And it's over the long term, it's much more productive because it doesn't deplete the soil and whatnot.
sure. And the other key point that comes up from that is the idea of sustainability, right? So you're creating a context where you're not permanently destroying the topsoil. You're finding a way to actually replenish it. And in doing so, it's something that can continue. Whereas if we continue down our factory model of destroying that topsoil, you're going to end up with a situation where you can no longer grow anything. But we wonder if that's the case. Why do we keep doing it? Well, it becomes easier, right? You have them in those rows, you have that monocrop, you can use the machines to harvest the stuff, and it becomes faster and easier. But ultimately, it's not sustainable. Yeah, that's another really great example, and actually something we're going to talk about in just a little bit too. So I want to introduce a quote from a couple of folks that are really well-known scholars in Taoism and also ancient Chinese philosophy, Ames and Hall. And in looking at this chapter, I like this quote that they say: "Opposites always entail each other and can only be separated abstractly, and at risk of upsetting the rhythm of life by treating them as really separable. Enforcing order produces disorder. Attempts at overt control or on behalf of a dyad at the expense of the other half, whether such manipulation be political or otherwise, simply makes things worse." And this is one of those, challenges that we have when we're thinking about how things transform continuously into the other. But we really like things to be a particular way, and we hold on to that way, and we don't allow for that change or for that uniqueness and that, impermanence, that we end up wrecking the system because that transition needs to be a part of it. So I had just a couple of final thoughts then on this. Areas of imbalance along those lines that we typically fall into. And I'm thinking more kind of broadly cultural than, individually necessarily, but there are things that have an impact on us. We're a product of our cultures. There's a lot that we inherit from our cultural worldview that sometimes we don't necessarily think about until we're forced to. We just kind of assume that that's the way they are. But in reality, and this is one of the key things the Taoists want us to really focus on, is that we're looking at the world through a set of lenses, and those lenses, we don't necessarily think about where they came from. And what they're asking us to do is to find ways to kind of clear those lenses, to pull that away so that we can see more directly, how things function, and what those patterns are and how we can work in harmony with it. And we can fail to be able to see those things if we continue to wear those glasses that we don't even realize that somebody has put on us. And one of those areas I would want to talk about is this idea of a growth mindset. So almost everything that I encounter in my social world is based on this. We've been talking about business. Obviously, that has an aspect to it we can think about from a political perspective. In fact, I've got a couple of subpoints. I'll just put these all out here. But if we're thinking about our financial systems, they're all based on being able to grow and continue to grow and continue to grow. Same thing with our population. The reason there's a lot of concern about the fact that the population growth is slowing down is so much of our system depends on there being more and more people. One of the things that we're going to be facing in our own country is the kind of shift in population from being more top heavy than bottom heavy in terms of, how do we support and care for our aging population when you've got a smaller base that's actively earning to pay into things like Social Security, or even in terms of how do we care for an aging population with fewer people. And food kind of goes hand in hand with that. We've got, if we're shooting for more and more people, then we have to figure out, well, how do we feed all these people? And so we've developed food systems that are trying to address that, much like Dan was bringing up with that factory farming that becomes efficient, but it becomes efficient at a great cost, because ultimately everything, all life on the planet, depends on that topsoil. And if we are just ruthlessly destroying it, and it's something that takes a lot of time to rebuild, then, the expedient thing, the immediate thing of how do we feed people and how do we continue this ongoing growth is going to ultimately not be sustainable. There's a lot of talk that the destruction of the topsoil is maybe an even greater threat than what we think of in terms of climate change, in terms of, the question about life on the planet. So we definitely have one half of the equation that's being looked at in terms of, if we think of that yin yang thing in terms of the growth, that we like that and we hold on to that and we do everything we can to keep that part of it in place. And there's definitely, we can look at this idea of imposing of a will that is driving these factors, but we can see that this is not a sustainable thing. And when we think in biological terms, if you have like a new species, whether it's a plant or an animal that gets introduced to a region that doesn't have any of its normal predators, the problem is it'll grow out of control. And in doing so, it threatens all the rest of the balance of the system. And even within our bodies, we can think about cells that tend to grow out of control. This would be a cancer, how destructive that can be. So the death part of it, the restriction is also, it's required for the whole system to work. You can't have just the growth without the decay. They go together. In fact, the decay is what feeds the growth. Ultimately, and it's a difficult concept for people sometimes to come to terms with, life feeds on life. There is no way for things to grow without other things dying. And it's when things are understood in that balance that these things are allowed to continue to have some sustainability into the future. Maybe see if you have some thoughts about that before I go to my final point.
I fully agree. And it's kind of weird because sometimes I'll mention, like, I don't want the population to grow. Like, I'm glad people aren't having like babies as much as they were. Like, you think of these older families that have like 12 kids. Like, they'll look at me funny, like, but if we don't grow, then like we're not gonna survive or whatever. I'm like, well, okay, but look what we're doing to the planet by like taking it over.
That's kind of an interesting statement, right? That if we don't grow, we're not going to survive, but yet that overgrowth is what's actually going to kill us.
Yeah. Like, and like, really take a second to think about this, because I don't know if you're thinking about it right.
Jim, do you know the philosopher Daniel Quinn?
It's not coming to mind.
Well, he wrote a book called Ishmael, which was made into a movie.
Oh, yes. Actually, I love that book, and I forgotten his name. But yeah.
Okay, yeah. He also wrote a book called The End of Civilization, which is one of my favorite books of all time. He uh, he introduces in there the idea. Well, it's kind of the common understanding is we have to produce more food to feed our growing population, which is actually the reverse of the biological reality. Because just like any biological species, as humans, Like any organism will grow to the extent of it that its resources and its environment will allow, and then it'll stop growing. But then if the resources are increased, the population will grow to match the resources. So it's not that our population grows and then we have to produce more food to feed the people, because people are made out of food. We have a certain population, we add food to that population, the population gets bigger. We add more food, the population gets bigger. It actually goes in that direction, just like all other biological organisms, that population growth is actually driven by an increase in food rather than the other way around.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a
And in particular, the Green Revolution that supposedly fed all the people in the third world actually if you have a starving population and you throw more food at it, what you get is a larger starving population.
yeah. Yeah, and it becomes a difficult situation because people will, point to starving children and say, this is horrible, we have to do something. And we can understand that compassion that gets drawn. And it's not an easy thing to understand exactly what we should do, but we can see that we definitely are, in a sense, at a larger scale, living beyond our means, that is going to have widespread consequences if we don't figure out some kind of solution. Yeah. Well, the last part of this that I wanted to bring in is the idea of health. And speaking about, life and death, this is one of those areas where, of course, nobody, wants to die, but that if we think about life and death in that same kind of yin yang concept, they are not antagonistic to each other. They actually go together. And it's the fact that things die that other things can live, and vice versa. It's an ongoing cycle that's necessary for how everything, all life on the planet functions. And so when we hold on to one side of that and push back at the other as though death is a bad thing, not only do we have a lot of psychological imbalance in terms of how we look at something like death and how much we resist it and fight against it, but then our attempts to hold on to life or health can lead to extremely unhealthy ways of being as well. And we can see the explosion in like the longevity movement and all the things that happen in terms of, the industry to try and keep people alive for as long as possible, is really, I think, missing the importance that death actually plays in the role of life. And these things they're not antagonistic. They're necessary and part of the whole process of how life even is possible. And that's not a very fun thing to think about, but it is. The more we think about it, the more we understand it, the more we can see the value of and how death plays a positive role, then I think we can make some good strides towards having a more healthy way of living, and more of an appreciation for life when we recognize its impermanence and its fragility. It actually adds to the significance and the value of life because it's ephemeral, because it's short. That if we don't recognize the balance between the two and we focus just on one side of that equation, we end up very mentally distraught, as well as, creating situations that are very devastating for others. If you've been watching this on video and you'd like to be a part of the live Zoom conversation, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get an email with our latest videos as well as links to come and join this conversation. And if you happen to be in the Southern California area, you can join the live conversation there as well. All right, guys, we'll see you next time.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.
See ya.